Boring history for sleep. What medieval schools were really like. Okay, settle in everyone. Tonight, we're taking a slow, boring trip back in time and back to school, medieval style. And nope, not the fun kind of school. Think way fewer lunch breaks and a lot more whacks with sticks. Sure, these places helped shape Western civilization. They also gave a whole bunch of kids permanent neck pain. Candlelight? You bet. Big ideas? Well, that's up for debate. So go ahead, get super cozy under your blanket. Ignore your girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, or wife. Ignore your emotional support snail, your emotionally distant orphan, your Tamagotchi. They'll get it. Now, let's drift into tonight's quiet journey through the tough, strange, and oddly long-lasting world of medieval education. Chapter 1: The 7 Types of Medieval Hardship. Let's start our tour with how medieval education was set up. 7 different kinds of schools, each with its own special way of making kids miserable. These weren't like today, where you pick between public or private schools. Nope. These were strict, top-down places that showed how obsessed medieval society was, with everyone knowing their exact place. Monastery schools were everywhere in the early medieval days, like big stone castles of learning and prayer. They popped up after Saint Benedict set up his rules in 529 AD and spread across Europe like a stubborn patch of weeds. By 1500, there were about 37,000 Benedictine monasteries in Europe, and roughly 1,850 of them had regular schools. Just picture that. Nearly 2,000 places where young boys got to experience the joy of waking up at 5 a.m. to learn Latin in rooms so cold, their breath made clouds. These monastery schools did 2 jobs at once, in a way only medieval places could. They trained future monks and also kept old books alive by copying them. The scriptoria, those writing rooms where monks spent decades copying texts by hand, were basically the medieval version of your modern copy machine, but infinitely slower and requiring you to never get married. Students included both boys planning to become monks and kids whose families were rich enough to pay for it. The outside students, or oblates, had a strange life. Not quite monks, not quite regular students, just somewhere in that fuzzy middle ground medieval society was so good at creating. The daily routine in these schools was as strict as church services. Students got up at 5 a.m. for morning prayers, had classes from 6 to 9 a.m., copied books until 11 a.m., ate and rested, then had more classes from 1 to 3 p.m. 4 p.m., studied in groups until 6 p.m., ate dinner, had evening prayers, and were ready for bed by 9 p.m. This schedule changed a lot with the seasons. Summer days could mean 16 hours of study, while winter squeezed learning into as little as 8 hours because there was no electric light. Imagine planning your whole school year around the sun with no lights to stay up late and no heat to make those dark winter months bearable. Cathedral schools were most important, between 1050 and 1200, really taking off after Charlemagne's rule in 789. AD said every bishop needed a school. This basically meant every big church had to educate people, creating Europe's first real school system. Cathedral schools were run by church leaders who handed out the licentia dicendi, the license to teach, which was like the medieval version of your teaching certificate, but way more important and needing years of religious study. These schools drew in teachers and students from all over, creating Europe's first international academic groups, centuries before anyone thought of student exchange programs. Famous spots like the cathedral schools of York, Paris, Chartres, and Reims usually had fewer than 100 students each, but had huge influence. Think of these schools as medieval think tanks, where the smartest people met to argue about things like whether angels could be in the same place at the same time, the kind of big questions that kept medieval scholars up at night. Grammar schools were the top level for learning Latin outside of universities. These bigger schools, tied to major churches or funded by towns, focused hard on getting students ready for university. By 1500, most English towns had grammar schools, creating a network of places dedicated to the systematic torture of Latin grammar. Maidstone Grammar School in Kent is one of the oldest still around, a place that's been drilling Latin verbs into unwilling students for over 700 years. The lessons in grammar schools started with basic Latin grammar and speaking skills early on, 1100 to 1300, then grew to include Greek, geography, and science later, 1300 to 1500. This change showed that maybe students could benefit from learning about the actual world, not just the rules for talking about it in dead languages. But change was super slow, as was typical for anything medieval. Elementary song schools were the basic level of medieval education, teaching simple reading through church music. Boys aged 7 to 12 learned to read and sing Latin hymns while picking up basic words. These schools, connected to big town churches, offered the widest chance for basic education, feeding students into the more advanced places. The idea was simple. If you could sing Latin psalms, you could probably learn to read Latin. Connecting music and reading made perfect sense in a world where most written stuff was religious and meant to be sung. The daily routine in song schools started with morning prayers, followed by singing practice and basic reading. Students learned the alphabet by singing, memorized prayers and hymns, practiced writing simple letters, and spent a lot of time learning proper Latin pronunciation through musical repetition. These schools must have sounded amazing. Dozens of young voices trying to get the hang of complex medieval church music while learning to read and write. Chantry schools came from rich people, leaving money for endless church services, creating a unique way to pay priest-teachers with land and rent income. Good examples include Catherine Lady Berkeley's school in Watton-under-Edge in 1384, and Archbishop Chichel's school at Higham Ferrers in 1422. These schools worked on the medieval idea that rich people could buy their way into heaven through good deeds while also educating poor and rural kids. The chantry system meant priests had to say masses for dead rich people's souls while also teaching local kids. This led to the weird situation where your child's education depended on some dead nobleman worrying about his soul. The priests got steady money from the land, but they had to balance teaching with endless prayers for people they'd never met. Many chantry schools had different priests for grammar and song lessons, and offered free tuition beyond small fees, giving kids in rural areas a chance at education they wouldn't have had otherwise. Guild schools ran alongside formal schools, offering 7 to 10-year apprenticeships that followed the master-journeyman apprentice setup. This hands-on education system trained most medieval young people who would go into trades instead of church or government jobs. The guild system created a totally different kind of education, one based on practical skills, learning by doing, and making things, rather than Latin grammar and religious arguments. Young apprentices, usually starting around 14 or 15, lived with master craftsmen and learned by watching and doing. They got food, a place to stay, and basic education in exchange for their work. The lessons included specific trade skills, basic reading, and math for business, guild traditions, and slowly moving up to become a journeyman, then maybe a master. This system created the skilled workers who built medieval cathedrals, copied books, made tools and weapons, and created everything that made medieval society run. Palace schools, like Charlemagne's court school, created special places for training future leaders and government workers. These schools mixed classic education with practical ruling skills, setting a pattern for noble education throughout the medieval period. The palace school model knew that future kings and nobles needed a different education than future priests or merchants. The lessons in palace schools included classic books and speaking skills for good communication, military strategy for leadership, law studies for judging, ways to act with other countries, and practical skills like hunting and fighting that fit noble life. Students in palace schools had perks no other students had: better food, warmer rooms, access to huge libraries, and direct contact with rulers who could help their careers. Chapter 2: Daily Routines. Now that we've looked at the different kinds of schools, let's talk about what medieval students actually did every day, the routines that shaped student life for centuries. Medieval school days followed church bells, meaning schedules changed wildly with the amount of daylight in ways that would make no sense to modern students, used to the same schedule, no matter the weather. A typical day started at 5 a.m. with getting up and morning prayers, which was both spiritual and practical. Students had no alarm clocks, so they relied on church bells and roosters. The morning prayers, usually 30 minutes, gave everyone time to fully wake up and take care of their religious duties. After prayers, students went to morning classes from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., taught by senior teachers on important texts. These ordinary lectures covered the main lessons, and everyone had to be there. The morning classes happened when the natural light was best, and everyone, teachers and students, was freshest. Teachers usually taught from raised desks, reading directly from important books while explaining things. Students listened and sometimes took notes, though paper was so expensive that most note-taking was tiny. The lecture style needed amazing focus, as students had no textbooks and relied completely on remembering and understanding what was said. The structured day continued with private study and copying books from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., using the good natural light for detailed work. Students were only allowed to attend 2 classes a day to avoid brain overload, a surprisingly modern idea of managing how much people could learn, recognizing that humans can only take in so much at once. This limit meant that learning moved at a steady pace, with plenty of time to think and let things sink in. During private study, students did different things depending on their level and what they had. Beginners practiced basic writing, copied simple texts, and memorized grammar rules. Advanced students worked on harder texts, got ready for debates, and did their own research on assigned topics. The copying work did 2 things. It helped them remember the texts and also develop the neat handwriting needed for any job involving writing. The midday meal and rest from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. gave them needed food and a break. Medieval meals and schools followed monastery traditions, usually bread, porridge, vegetables from the gardens, sometimes fish, and weak ale or watered wine. The quality and amount of food changed a lot based on how rich the school was and the student's family. Rich students might get meat, cheese, and nicer bread, while poor students lived on coarse bread, thin porridge, and whatever vegetables were in season. Mealtime was also for socializing, letting students and teachers talk casually, discuss school questions outside of class, and keep up the human connections that held the school together. Meals often included readings from religious or classic books, so education continued even during downtime. Afternoon, extraordinary lectures from 1 to 4 p.m. were given by junior teachers or advanced students, covering extra material and review sessions. These sessions gave younger teachers experience and students more chances to hear the material. The extraordinary lectures often focused on how to use the morning's theories, clearing up tough ideas, and getting ready for tests or debates. Study groups and tutoring happened from 4 to 6 p.m., allowing students to teach each other and learn together. These sessions recognized that students learned well from their peers, especially when tackling difficult material. Advanced students often tutored younger ones, creating mentor relationships that strengthened the school community and gave teaching experience to future teachers. The evening meal from 6 to 7 p.m. was followed by evening prayers, private study, and getting ready for bed by 9 p.m. Evening study often continued by candlelight, if families could afford it, though this luxury was out of reach for most students. The cost and fire risk of candles meant most studying ended with sunset, creating natural rhythms that modern schools have largely dropped. Summer schedules could extend study time to 16 hours daily, while winter squeezed learning into as few as 8 hours because of limited daylight. This seasonal change meant students had very different amounts of school throughout the year, with longer summer sessions making up for shorter winter ones. The school year followed farming seasons, with breaks during harvest, when students might go home to help on the farm. Prayer times broke up the school day at regular intervals. Students attended early morning prayers, dawn prayers, 6 a.m. prayers, 9 a.m. prayers, noon prayers, 3 p.m. prayers, evening prayers, and before bed prayers, mixing religious observance with learning. These religious breaks served practical purposes beyond just spiritual growth, providing mental rest, physical movement, and chances to socialize, preventing the mental burnout that could come from constant study. Mixing prayer and study showed the medieval idea that learning was a spiritual journey, needing God's help. Students were expected to pray for wisdom and understanding, while teachers started each day's lessons with prayers for good teaching. This spiritual framework gave meaning and purpose to the often difficult process of mastering tough school material. Winter was especially hard for medieval students and teachers. Unheated classrooms became almost unbearable in the coldest months, forcing students to wear heavy cloaks and fingerless gloves while trying to write. Ink could freeze in inkwells, making writing impossible without careful warming. The shorter daylight hours packed all activities into small time windows, and no artificial lighting meant detailed work was impossible after dark. Many schools dealt with winter problems with a calefactory system, warming houses with shared fires that were the only heated common space. These fires were lit on November 1st and kept going until Good Friday, creating places where students could warm up during the coldest times. The calefactory was both a necessity and a social hub where students and teachers could keep up their community bonds During the isolating winter months, the seasonal rhythms of medieval education created a completely different relationship to learning than modern students experience. Education followed natural cycles rather than artificial schedules, with intense periods of activity when conditions were good and needed rest when the weather was harsh. This approach recognized human limits while working within environmental limits that shaped every part of medieval life. Chapter 3: The 7 Core Subjects. Now let's look at what medieval students actually studied during those long hours of learning and arguing. Medieval lessons focused on the 7 liberal arts, split into the basic trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the advanced quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Students usually started the trivium around ages 13 to 16, taking 3 to 4 years to finish and earning a Bachelor of Arts degree. This structured approach made sure they were fully ready before moving on to specialized studies, building a strong base for lifelong learning and careers. Grammar was the foundation of medieval education, focusing heavily on mastering Latin using standard textbooks that stayed the same for centuries. Donatus's Ars Minor and Ars Major from the 4th century gave basic Latin grammar through question and answer formats, covering the 8 parts of speech. These books had been around for over 600 years by the medieval period, showing how good they were and how little medieval education changed. The Ars Minor had short definitions and rules for how Latin nouns and verbs changed, and basic sentence structure. Students memorized these rules by repeating them constantly, saying the forms over and over until they could instantly get them right. The question and answer style meant teachers could quickly check what students knew, and students learned to recall things fast, which was needed for more advanced writing. Priscian's Institutiones Grammaticae, an 18-volume detailed explanation with over 1,000 copies still existing, was the advanced text for word structure and sentence rules. This huge work gave a full breakdown of Latin grammar, including deep talks about where words came from, how they related to each other, and different writing styles. Students usually spent 2 to 3 years working through Priscian's books, getting a deep understanding of Latin structure that would help their scholarly work their whole lives. Teaching methods stressed the question and answer approach, with teachers asking questions and students giving memorized answers. This method made sure students could remember grammar rules quickly and correctly, while also building the speaking skills needed for later rhetoric training. Parsing exercises broke down classic texts, word by word, teaching students to figure out grammar roles, explain sentence relationships, and understand how meaning came from the structure. Dictation and copying exercises strengthened grammar rules, while building the handwriting skills essential for any job involving writing. Students spent countless hours memorizing rules, building the base for all higher learning through intense practice. Modern educators might find this boring, but medieval teachers knew that mastering grammar needed instant recall of basic rules before students could get into complex literary or philosophical texts. Rhetoric lessons used Cicero's De Inventione and Quintilian's 12-volume Institutio Oratoria to teach the 5 parts of rhetoric: inventio, finding arguments; dispositio, arranging them; elocutio, style; memoria, memory; and pronunciatio, delivery. Students went from analyzing good speeches to writing their own, taking part in fake trials and debates that built practical communication skills needed for law and government jobs. The inventio stage taught students to find and develop arguments by carefully looking at topics, situations, and evidence. Students learned to pinpoint the main points in any argument, gather important information, and build strong arguments based on logic, not just emotions. This training was vital for future lawyers, government workers, and church officials who would spend their careers solving problems and writing policies. Dispositio focused on organizing arguments to be most effective, teaching students to put their material in a logical order that would convince audiences while dealing with possible objections. Medieval students learned to create introductions that made them sound believable, present evidence in a convincing way, and write conclusions that moved audiences to act. This organizational training influenced medieval writing in all areas, from religious writings to government documents. Elocutio covered style and word choices, teaching students to match their speaking to their audience and purpose. Students looked at how different words, sentence structures, and figures of speech created different effects, while learning to avoid pompous talk that could put off practical audiences. This style training helped future government workers talk effectively with everyone, from farmers asking for help to royal courts. Memoria techniques taught students to memorize and deliver long speeches without notes, using clever mental systems that linked ideas with familiar places or vivid images. These memory methods were essential in a world without teleprompters or written scripts, where good speakers needed to deliver complex arguments from memory while sounding natural and reacting to the audience. Pronunciatio covered how to speak, gesture, and present oneself physically, teaching students to use their whole body for effective communication. Medieval students learned proper gestures for different kinds of arguments, voice techniques for keeping the audience's attention, and a physical presence that made them seem believable and authoritative. This acting training showed how public medieval professional life was, where a good performance could make or break a career. Logic instruction, seen as the peak of the trivium, used Aristotle's organon and Boethius's comments to teach syllogistic reasoning and formal debate. Students learned to spot wrong arguments, build valid ones, and join in the competitive debates that would be a big part of their university life. This training in thinking clearly gave them tools for analyzing everything, from religious questions to legal arguments. Syllogistic reasoning taught students to build arguments in the form of a big idea, a small idea, a conclusion. For example, all men die, big idea. Socrates is a man, small idea. Therefore, Socrates will die, conclusion. Students spent months learning to tell valid from invalid syllogisms, understanding how logical connections created certainty, or just likelihood in different kinds of arguments. Spotting fallacies helped students recognize when opponents used bad reasoning, emotional tricks, or unrelated evidence to support their points. Medieval students learned to spot dozens of specific fallacies, from simple mistakes like assuming the effect proves the cause, to complex tricks that might fool even educated audiences. This analytical training was super valuable in a world where religious, legal, and political arguments needed careful logical thought. Formal debate was the ultimate logic training, where students defended assigned positions against anyone through structured arguments. These public exercises tested students' ability to think fast, respond to unexpected challenges, and stay logically consistent under pressure. Teachers judged students based on their reasoning skills, not their specific conclusions, encouraging clear thinking no matter what ideas were being defended. The quadrivium was advanced math and science education that students usually started after finishing the trivium. Arithmetic focused on pure number theory, using Boethius's De Institutione Arithmetica, teaching ratios, proportions, and the religious meaning of numbers. Medieval mathematicians saw numbers as basic building blocks of all creation, making arithmetic both practical calculation and spiritual thinking. Students learned the four basic operations: adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, using Roman numerals and counting boards, rather than the Arabic numbers that would later change European math. The ways they calculated needed a lot of memorization and practice, as students had to do complex math without written steps or machines. Merchants and government workers especially valued these skills for managing money, calculating taxes, and trading. Number theory looked at the magical properties of different number relationships, teaching students about perfect numbers, triangular numbers, and the math ratios that made music harmonious. These studies showed the medieval belief that math relationships revealed God's order in creation, making arithmetic study a form of religious inquiry, as well as practical training. Geometry lessons relied on Euclid's Elements for theory, combined with practical uses in architecture and surveying. Students learned to draw geometric shapes, using only a compass and straight edge, proving theorems through logical steps rather than measuring. This training built spatial reasoning skills while teaching the kind of systematic proof techniques that influenced how medieval scholars approached religious and philosophical arguments. Practical geometry uses included surveying land for farming and legal reasons, planning buildings, and navigation for sea and land travel. Students learned to calculate areas and volumes, draw right angles for building foundations, and use geometric rules to solve real-world measurement problems. Theoretical geometry explored the deep meaning of math relationships, asking questions about the nature of space, infinity, and how abstract math ideas connected to the physical world. These studies influenced medieval ideas about the universe, religion, and science, as scholars tried to understand how geometric rules showed divine creation. Music education stressed the math rules behind harmony, rather than playing instruments, using Boethius's De Institutione Musica to explore proportions and ratios in musical intervals. Medieval music theory divided music into three types: musica mundana, harmony of the universe; musica humana, harmony within the human soul; and musica instrumentalis, music made by instruments and voices. Students learned to calculate the math ratios that created pleasing and clashing sounds, understanding how simple number relationships like 2 to 1, octave, and 3 to 2, perfect fifth, formed the basic parts of medieval harmony. This math-based way of looking at music showed broader medieval beliefs about how all knowledge was connected and how math was the base of creation. Practical music lessons included learning to read music, understanding the 8 church modes that controlled church music, and basic composing for simple melodies and harmonies. Students in cathedral and monastery schools got more hands-on training, as they needed to take part in daily church services that required good music skills. Music theory also looked at how different music styles affected ethics and health, as medieval scholars believed that specific musical patterns could influence human behavior and feelings. This psychological understanding of music influenced medieval medicine, education, and spiritual guidance, as people used music to treat different physical and mental issues. Astronomy lessons used the Tractatus de Sphæra and Ptolemy's writings to teach about how planets move, how to calculate the calendar, and astrological ideas that were still important for medicine and farming. Medieval astronomy mixed careful observations with theoretical models that tried to explain planet movements through complex geometric systems. Students learned to use tools like astrolabes for measuring star positions, calculating dates for religious holidays, and figuring out times for daily prayers. The practical uses of astronomy included navigation for travelers, timing for planting and harvesting, and medical practices that linked human health to influences from the stars. Astrology taught students to interpret the supposed influences of planet positions on human events, weather, and nature. While modern science has rejected these ideas, medieval scholars saw astrology as a key part of natural science, medicine, and political planning. Students learned to calculate horoscopes, predict weather, and advise clients on good times for important decisions. Theoretical astronomy explored deep questions about the universe's structure, the nature of celestial bodies, and the connection between earthly and heavenly events. These studies influenced medieval ideas about the universe and religion, as scholars tried to understand how geometric rules showed divine creation. Chapter 4: Classrooms and Materials. Now that we've looked at what medieval students studied, let's talk about the actual places where they learned. Medieval classrooms showed the time's social and intellectual pecking order through how they were set up and what furniture they had, making spaces that reinforced the strict social differences of medieval life. Most schools operated in single rooms that held all students and one teacher, often using existing church buildings that emphasized education's religious roots. Grammar schools attached to cathedrals or big churches used what was already there, instead of building special school facilities, working within buildings designed for worship, not teaching. The teacher's raised desk was both practical and a powerful symbol of authority, letting teachers watch their students and showing the top-down relationship between teacher and student that was everywhere in medieval education. This high position meant teachers could see student behavior, keep order, and project their voice well to everyone. The physical height difference reinforced the intellectual and social power teachers had over their students. Students sat on long wooden benches, often also used as storage chests with hinged seats, sharing tables or working directly on their laps when individual desks weren't available. These multi-purpose furnishings showed the practical needs of schools with limited money and space, while the shared seating created social rankings based on age, family background, and how well they did in school. Medieval classroom furniture was often light and movable because medieval life was unstable. Folding chairs and trestle tables with removable tops allowed quick moves when political or military problems meant schools had to pack up fast. Wars, raids, and political unrest could force schools to move with little warning, making movable furniture key to keeping education going. Lecterns and reading stands were essential for teachers and advanced students, designed with clever parts for holding multiple books at once. These tools let teachers refer to several important texts during lectures, comparing different sources and giving full explanations of complex topics. The smart design of medieval book furniture showed how central texts were to learning. Lighting depended entirely on natural light for most of the school day, meaning huge seasonal changes in how much study time was available, which would make no sense to modern students used to steady electric lights. Windows rarely had glass, just simple openings that might be sealed with plaster in winter, forcing students to choose between light and warmth. The quality of natural light changed a lot throughout the day and seasons, affecting both how much and how well teaching happened. Morning light was seen as best for detailed work, like copying books and writing, while afternoon light was good enough for lectures and talking. Cloudy days could severely limit school activities, while sunny days gave chances for longer study sessions. When artificial light was needed, tallow candles made from animal fat gave smoky, stinky light that created more health and fire risks. These candles produced poor light that strained students' eyes while filling classrooms with harsh smoke that could cause breathing problems. The smell of burning fat was especially unpleasant, creating a smell that modern people would find unbearable. Expensive beeswax candles were saved for rich schools and special times, giving cleaner and better light, but costing too much for most schools to use regularly. The financial realities of medieval education meant most detailed work had to be done during daylight hours, severely limiting intense study time in winter. The calefactory system in monastery schools was the only heated common space, with shared fires lit on November 1st and kept going until Good Friday. Students could warm themselves in these rooms during the coldest times when unheated cloisters were unusable for long periods. The calefactory was both a necessity and a social hub where students and teachers could stay connected during the isolating winter months. Most buildings used central fire pits, with smoke escaping through holes in the roof, creating tough environments that needed constant adjustment. The smoky air of medieval buildings would seem toxic by modern standards, while fire risks constantly threatened students and valuable books. Students had to get used to smoky conditions while learning to work around the limits of medieval heating systems. Storage solutions showed how precious books and writing materials were in a time when one book could mean months of skilled work and huge money. Wall-mounted book chests and individual book boxes protected valuable books from theft and damage, while giving organized access to the small collections most schools had. The medieval spinning desk idea let multiple books rotate on one surface, making it easy to access different texts while using minimal space. These clever devices showed medieval smarts in solving practical problems with limited resources, while book wheels created carousel-like devices for accessing many texts at once in the most advanced schools. Security for books included locked chests, chained books in libraries, and careful watching of students accessing valuable texts. The financial value of books meant their theft was a serious crime, while their rarity made careful preservation essential for keeping schools running. Students learned to handle books with extreme care, knowing that damaging a book could effectively end their education. Writing materials needed extensive specialized knowledge and prep that modern students would find incredibly complex and expensive. Parchment production needed sheepskin, which cost less than calfskin, but was still a big financial investment for most families. The process involved soaking skins in lime for days to remove hair, stretching them on frames, and scraping with curved knives, before rubbing with pumice and treating with chalk or lime pastes. One calfskin made about 3.5 medium writing sheets after a 2 to 3 week drying process under tension, making books extremely expensive and precious. Big gospel books could need over 500 calfskins and take more than a person-year of work, with finished books and wooden covers weighing over 75 pounds. The physical size and huge cost of books meant most students had very little access to written materials. Ink preparation followed complex recipes that medieval students had to master before they could start serious writing. Iron gall ink needed oak galls, iron sulfate, gum arabic, and water in equal parts. The process involved crushing oak galls containing tannic acid from wasp larvae, soaking them in water for 2 weeks with frequent stirring, then adding iron sulfate and gum arabic to create the purple-black color through chemical reaction. The best galls came from Aleppo and were expensive imports that many schools couldn't afford regularly, forcing students and teachers to use local alternatives that made lower quality ink. Fresh ink looked purple-black before turning brown over time, showing a book's age, which modern readers can still see in old medieval documents. Quill pen preparation was another essential skill, needing main flight feathers from geese, swans, or turkeys that had to be properly dried and prepared. Feathers needed drying for at least 1 year, sometimes dutched in heated sand for proper curing that made them good for long writing use. Cutting the pen involved complex series of cuts to create writing tips, needing considerable skill and practice that students had to master to write legibly. Quills needed frequent recutting and replacement, making pen maintenance a constant worry for medieval students who had to balance studying with keeping their writing tools ready. The art of making quills was passed down through generations of scribes and teachers with different techniques, making pens suitable for different writing tasks. Students also used wax tablets for practice, using styluses to write and erase repeatedly without using up precious parchment. These reusable surfaces allowed extensive practice in letter formation and basic exercises before progressing to permanent writing on expensive materials. The wax tablets were the medieval version of scratch paper, letting students work through problems and practice techniques without wasting valuable resources. The cost of writing materials created big hurdles to education that effectively kept most people from advanced learning. Full university costs range from about 48 to 64 florins for English schools, 80 to 108 florins for Paris, and 60 plus florins for Bologna annually, when day laborers earned about 10 florins a year. A middle-class tailor earning 60 florins a year found university education costs equal to their complete income, making advanced education only for rich families or those with major financial help. The money barriers to education meant most medieval learning happened through talking and memorizing rather than individual reading and writing, creating teaching methods that stressed group learning and shared memory rather than individual study. This financial reality shaped medieval teaching in fundamental ways that continued to influence education long after books became cheaper. Chapter 5: The Hard Realities of Student Life, Health, Living Conditions, and Social Ladders. Now let's look at the daily living conditions medieval students put up with while getting their education, conditions that would probably shock modern students used to heated dorms, regular meals, and basic health care. Medieval student life changed a lot by social class and where they lived, creating school experiences that went from fairly comfortable for rich nobles to barely surviving for poor scholars. Medieval education showed and reinforced society's strict social classes through very different school experiences based on family background and social status. Nobility, about 3% of the population, had private tutors and went to cathedral schools, learning Latin, speaking skills, grammar, math, music, and court manners that got them ready for leadership roles in the church, government, and military. Noble students usually lived in private rooms with personal servants, ate good meals that included meat and fine bread, wore expensive clothes made of nice wool and fur, and had access to huge libraries and book collections. Their education focused on practical skills needed for ruling and fighting, alongside classic learning, creating a curriculum that balanced brain power with the real-world needs of aristocratic life. Noble girls were taught music, dance, and etiquette to get them ready for marriage, which would let them manage big households and take part in court life, while their brothers prepared for government and military leadership that needed both classic education and practical training in warfare and ruling. The gender differences in noble education showed medieval beliefs about proper roles for men and women, while making sure both sexes got the education needed for their expected social roles. The clergy, 5 to 10% of the population, got the most complete formal education through cathedral and monastery schools that gave systematic training in the complete 7 liberal arts, along with theology, church law, and Latin literature. Church education was the only way for women to get higher learning, through convent schools, where nuns reached education levels that wouldn't be seen again until the 18th century. Clerical students usually lived in shared dorms with shared sleeping spaces, ate simple but enough meals following monastery diet rules, wore special religious clothing that showed their status, and spent large parts of their time on religious duties that broke up their school schedules. The church life offered education in exchange for vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience that shaped every part of their daily life. Commoners, 90% of the population, were mostly unable to read or write, with minimal access to formal education that might improve their social standing. Peasant children sometimes went to monastery schools for basic reading, but most education was practical and informal, focusing on farming skills, crafts, and survival knowledge passed down through family and community. When common children did get formal education, they usually lived in the poorest available housing, often sleeping on straw mattresses in unheated spaces, eating the simplest food from charity, wearing rough wool clothes given by benefactors, and working as servants to pay for their schooling. The difference between rich and poor students in the same schools constantly reminded everyone of the social classes that were everywhere in medieval life. Guild apprenticeships, starting around ages 14 to 15, gave job training for city youth, creating skilled workers through hands-on experience rather than academic lessons. These apprenticeships offered practical education in specific trades while providing room, board, and eventual financial freedom, creating alternatives to formal schooling that served most medieval youth who would go into business rather than church jobs. Communal dormitories housed all students in single large rooms with straw mattresses, wool blankets, and shared sleeping spaces that made it easy for diseases to spread while giving minimal privacy or personal space. Students slept in their regular clothes, removing only outer garments, with talking forbidden after certain sleep times, enforced by night patrol monks who made sure everyone followed school rules. The dorm environment created tough social dynamics as students from different backgrounds were forced to live close together while keeping the social differences that ruled medieval life. Rich students might arrange for better bedding and food, while poor students made do with what the school provided, creating visible inequalities within supposedly equal school communities. Each monastery had an infirmary for sick and old members, where the infirmarian treated monks, students, pilgrims, and local poor, using treatments based on the four humors theory that linked blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile with different physical and mental conditions. Bloodletting was common for rebalancing humors, while extensive herbal medicine gardens provided treatment options combined with prayer, laying on of hands, and exorcism for serious conditions. Medieval medical theory blamed most illnesses on imbalances among the four humors, leading to treatments that tried to fix the right amounts through diet, bloodletting, purging, and herbal medicines. Students suffering from illness might be bled regularly, given bitter herbal mixtures, prayed over, and kept away from healthy people until their humors were balanced again. Daily hygiene practices included expected face and hand washing with cold water, hand washing before and after eating, and weekly topping and tailing that involved cleaning face, armpits, and private areas with cold water and rough soap. Students chewed hazel twigs as toothbrushes and used ground herbs for cleaning teeth, though job hazards included eye strain from poor lighting, back problems from bending over writing, and lead poisoning from inks and paints. The hygiene standards medieval students kept would seem lacking by modern standards, though they were big improvements over what most people did. Regular bathing was seen as unhealthy and possibly wrong, while shared living meant diseases spread quickly through student groups with little understanding of how they spread or how to stop them. Nutritional challenges came from limited diets, causing anemia and vitamin deficiencies, while breathing problems from cold and damp conditions were common throughout the school year. Monastery schools usually gave two main meals following monastery tradition: dinner around 11 a.m. and supper around 6 p.m., made up of bread, porridge, vegetables from monastery gardens, occasional fish, and weak ale or watered wine. During Lent and other religious fasts, meals were cut to one a day, with small portions that tested students' physical strength while supposedly making them stronger spiritually. Seasonal changes meant fresh produce in summer and fall, but preserved foods and stored grains in winter and spring, often leading to nutritional deficiencies and health problems. University student food costs were about £1, 1 shilling annually for basic food, typically including dark bread made from coarse grains, pottage, grain porridge with occasional vegetables, small ale that was safer than water, and occasional cheese or eggs when available. The bland diet provided basic nutrition, but little variety or pleasure, adding to the generally severe atmosphere of medieval schools. Student clothing showed social class differences while fitting school rules that emphasized modesty and proper behavior. Rich students wore wool robes in deep colors like blue or red, fur-trimmed cloaks that provided warmth and showed status, and leather shoes that protected their feet while showing their wealth. Poor students wore rough wool robes in brown or gray, simple cloth cloaks that gave minimal protection from weather, and wooden clogs, or went barefoot if they couldn't afford proper shoes. All students needed full sets of clothes for public appearances, though poor students might own only the clothes they wore, while rich students possessed multiple sets for different occasions and seasons. The clothing differences created visible signs of social class that reinforced the money inequalities everywhere in medieval society. The contrast between different students' living conditions created school environments where social classes were constantly visible. and reinforced through daily interactions. Rich students enjoyed better food, clothes, and housing, while poor students struggled with basic survival needs, creating school communities that reflected, rather than challenged, the broader social inequalities of medieval civilization. Chapter 6: Discipline and Punishment. Now that we've looked at the physical conditions of medieval student life, let's turn to the ways they kept students in line and helped shape their character. Medieval schools used strict discipline that showed the beliefs of the time about education, childhood, and how society should work in ways that would seem incredibly harsh to modern people. Birching was the main type of physical punishment, using bundles of leafless twigs, usually birch, but also willow or hazel, tied together for whipping on bare buttocks, backs, or shoulders. Schools had special furniture like birching donkeys or wooden blocks where students would kneel or bend during punishment, creating formal settings where physical discipline became a public show that reinforced the school's authority. Horsing involved holding the student being punished over another student's back, creating a group punishment system where students took part in disciplining their peers while seeing the results of disobedience. Important schools like Eton College required students to kneel on special wooden blocks during punishment, adding physical pain to the shame of public correction. Medieval scholars like Alexander of Neckham, Vincent of Beauvais, and John Bromyard supported a system where, when the ugliness of the crime is great, should the weight of the penalty inflicted be bitter. This systematic approach tried to match how severe the punishment was to how bad the offense was, while keeping the authority structure that ran medieval schools. The graduated punishment system used single wooden rods for lighter offenses instead of birch bundles, with punishment supposedly stopped when things are done as required, and avoiding excessive harshness that might break a student's spirit or harm learning goals. Some schools use the threat of birching as effectively as actual punishment, creating disciplined environments based on fear and respect for authority that shaped student behavior through anticipation rather than actual violence. Behavioral expectations reflected monastery traditions, emphasizing complete obedience and self-control that prepared students for lives serving the church and state. Students were expected to show that a child does not remain angry, he is not spiteful, does not contradict the professors, but receives with confidence what is taught him. These expectations created school environments where questioning authority or disagreeing could lead to severe punishment. Students were forbidden from talking in dorms during set silent times that might last for hours each day, had to maintain proper posture and attention during lessons no matter how uncomfortable they were, and were expected to respect books and learning materials that often cost huge amounts of money. The rules for behavior created full systems of social control that went beyond academic performance to include every part of student life. Academic expectations included speaking only Latin during school hours, mandatory attendance at all religious services regardless of weather or personal health, preparing lessons without exception or excuse, and showing respect for church authority that reinforced the religious foundations of medieval education. Students from different social classes faced varied behavioral expectations, with nobles expected to maintain aristocratic poise, while poor students working as servants had different standards that showed their financial dependence. The master-student relationship stressed the teacher's complete authority, with students addressing masters with great respect that showed broader medieval social ladders. Small class sizes meant teachers knew each student personally over many years, creating relationships where students learned not just ideas, but the full scholarly personality of their masters, including their habits, values, and ways of approaching intellectual problems. The circuiter, a patrol monk, enforced dorm discipline and prevented unauthorized activities like forbidden candle use that could cause fires or let students study beyond approved hours. These supervision systems created full-time watching that monitored student behavior around the clock, while making sure they followed school rules and religious duties. The disciplinary philosophy behind medieval education focused on building character through obedience to authority rather than developing independent thinking or personal freedom. Students learned to suppress their individual desires in favor of school rules, preparing them for lives serving the church, state, or noble households, where obedience and self-control were essential virtues. Physical punishment served many purposes beyond just correcting behavior, including publicly showing the school's authority, reinforcing social hierarchies that put teachers above students, and preparing them for adult roles where obeying legitimate authority would be required. The public nature of punishment meant all students saw the consequences of disobedience while learning to internalize the values and expectations of medieval society. The psychological effects of medieval discipline created students who were used to outside authority and rules rather than being self-directed and personally responsible. This training met medieval society's needs for obedient clergy, administrators, and professionals, while possibly limiting individual creativity and intellectual independence. Medieval punishment also showed beliefs about childhood that saw young people as naturally prone to evil and needing strict correction to develop moral character. The education philosophy assumed children wouldn't choose good behavior without outside force, making physical discipline an essential part of moral education rather than just managing behavior. The mixing of academic and moral discipline meant that school failures often got the same punishments as behavior problems, creating school environments where poor academic performance became a moral failing, needing correction through physical punishment. This approach reinforced the medieval belief that intellectual growth and moral character were inseparable parts of human development. The seasonal changes in discipline showed the natural rhythms that ruled medieval life, with stricter enforcement during winter, when being cooped up increased tensions, and more relaxed rules during summer, when outdoor activities gave students outlets for their energy. The discipline calendar often matched religious observances, with increased strictness during Lent and other periods of penance. Chapter 7. The Medieval University Experience. While primary education offered a foundation, the true intellectual engine of the later medieval period was the university. These weren't just bigger schools. They were entirely new kinds of institutions that shaped knowledge, scholarship, and professional life in Europe for centuries to come. The first universities emerged organically from the growth of cathedral schools and the demands of an increasingly complex society. Bologna, Paris, and Oxford are usually seen as the earliest, each developing its unique focus. Bologna became famous for law, particularly civil and canon law, attracting students from across Europe who sought practical training for legal and administrative careers. Paris, on the other hand, became the unrivaled center for theology and the liberal arts, drawing the brightest minds to debate, the great philosophical and religious questions of the age. Oxford followed, initially strong in theology, and later notable for its contributions to natural philosophy and logic. These universities, unlike the earlier monastery or cathedral schools, were distinct corporate bodies with their own charters, privileges, and governance structures. They were often nations of students and masters, organized by region of origin, fiercely protective of their rights against local townspeople and even royal authority. This corporate independence, often hard-won through conflicts with bishops and municipal governments, was a key feature that allowed universities to develop as centers of free inquiry and debate, albeit within the bounds of Christian doctrine. A typical university experience for a student was long and rigorous, starting around age 14 or 15, after completing grammar school. The first major phase was the Faculty of Arts, where students spent 3 to 4 years mastering the 7 liberal arts, culminating in a Bachelor of Arts, BA, degree. This was essentially the prerequisite for all higher faculties. The BA wasn't seen as an end in itself, but a necessary stepping stone. Students then had the option to continue for another few years to become a Master of Arts, MA, which then qualified them to teach in the arts faculty themselves. This MA was crucial because it granted the licentia docente, the right to teach anywhere. After earning their MA, the most ambitious students could move on to one of the higher faculties, theology, law, or medicine. These studies were even longer, often taking 5 to 10 years or more. Theology was considered the queen of the sciences and the most prestigious, leading to a doctorate that marked a scholar as an absolute authority in religious matters. Law faculties, particularly in Bologna, prepared students for high-level positions in civil and church courts, while medical faculties taught a blend of classical medical texts, like Hippocrates and Galen, practical observation, and a fair bit of astrological theory. The main teaching methods at university were lectures and disputations. Lectures involved the master reading from an authoritative text, adding his own explanations and comments. Students were expected to listen, memorize, and occasionally take notes on expensive parchment. These weren't interactive discussions as we might imagine. They were often solemn, one-way transfers of information. Disputations, however, were where the real intellectual fireworks happened. These were formal, structured debates, where students, under the guidance of a master, would defend a specific argument against all comers. A typical disputation involved a student stating a position, then opponents raising objections, and the student having to respond, often relying heavily on logical reasoning and quick wit. These were public events, testing a student's ability to think on their feet, construct coherent arguments, and defend their ideas under pressure. It was like a medieval academic rap battle, but with more Latin and less rhyming. Disputations honed critical thinking, rhetorical skills, and the ability to articulate complex ideas, preparing students for careers where reasoned argument was paramount, whether in the courtroom, the church pulpit, or royal administration. Life as a university student was far from glamorous. Most lived in colleges, which were essentially communal living and study halls, often with their own chapels and libraries, or rented rooms in town. These colleges provided a more organized and disciplined environment than just lodging freely, offering meals, common study areas, and stricter rules. Food was generally simple and repetitive, much like in monastery schools: bread, porridge, watery ale, and seasonal vegetables. Meat was a rare luxury for the general student, usually reserved for feast days or for wealthier students who could afford extra. Student life was also marked by financial hardship. As mentioned earlier, the costs were immense for most families. Many students relied on scholarships or patronage from wealthy individuals or church institutions. For poor students, this often meant working as servants for masters or wealthier students, performing menial tasks in exchange for room, board, or tuition. This created an incredibly diverse student body in terms of social background, although the upper echelons of academia remained largely the domain of the privileged. Despite the hardships, universities fostered an incredible intellectual ferment. They became melting pots of ideas, drawing scholars from across Europe who communicated in the universal language of Latin. This academic mobility led to the rapid spread of knowledge, new ideas, and intellectual currents. It was in these universities that scholasticism, the dominant philosophical and theological movement of the High Middle Ages, reached its peak, attempting to reconcile classical philosophy, especially Aristotle, with Christian doctrine. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham, all university educated, profoundly shaped Western thought through their rigorous logical analysis and monumental works. The impact of medieval universities was immense. They professionalized learning, creating distinct academic disciplines and setting standards for intellectual rigor. They produced educated elites, lawyers, doctors, theologians, and administrators who staffed the growing bureaucracies of church and state, profoundly influencing the development of European governance, law, and intellectual life. The very structure of modern universities, with their faculties, departments, degrees, BA, MA, PhD, and emphasis on lectures and research, can be traced directly back to these medieval institutions. They were places of both intense discipline and vibrant intellectual exchange, where the foundations of modern Western intellectual tradition were laid, often through endless debates in cold, stone halls. Chapter 8: Daily Challenges and Student Well-Being. Beyond the formal lessons and academic structure, medieval student life was shaped by constant daily challenges that tested their endurance and determination. These were not environments designed for comfort, but rather for shaping resilient minds and bodies, often through hardship. One of the most persistent difficulties was cold. Classrooms and dormitories, typically in stone buildings with minimal heating, could be brutally cold, especially during long winters. Imagine sitting for hours, trying to concentrate on a Latin text, with your fingers numb and your breath fogging in the air. Students often wore multiple layers of thick wool clothing, cloaks, and even fingerless gloves to try and retain some body heat. The only relief might be the occasional visit to a communal warming house or calefactory, where a fire might offer temporary respite. This constant exposure to cold not only made study uncomfortable, but also contributed to widespread respiratory illnesses. Hygiene was another significant challenge. While medieval people were more concerned with cleanliness than often depicted, their methods and resources were limited. Regular full-body bathing was rare, often considered unhealthy or even morally dubious in some circles. Instead, students practiced topping and tailing, washing their faces, hands, underarms, and private areas with cold water and rough soap. Communal living in dormitories, with shared sleeping spaces and often poor sanitation, meant that diseases spread rapidly. Fleas, lice, and other parasites were a common nuisance, adding to the general discomfort. Latrines were often basic pits, contributing to unsanitary conditions. Nutrition was also a constant concern, especially for poorer students. While monastic institutions aimed to provide adequate sustenance, the diet was typically monotonous and often lacking in key nutrients. As we mentioned, staples included coarse bread, thin pottage, a thick soup of grains and vegetables, and small beer or watered wine. Fresh produce was seasonal, and meat was a luxury. This limited diet often led to vitamin deficiencies and anemia, impacting students' energy levels, concentration, and overall health. During religious fasts, which were frequent throughout the academic year, meals would be further reduced, pushing students to their physical limits. The constant underlying hunger and physical weakness would have been a pervasive backdrop to their intellectual pursuits. Health issues were unfortunately common. Beyond respiratory illnesses from cold and damp, students faced various other ailments. Eye strain was a frequent complaint due to poor lighting conditions, especially when trying to read or copy manuscripts by flickering candlelight. Back problems were also common, a result of long hours spent hunched over desks or writing surfaces, often in uncomfortable postures on hard benches. Lead poisoning, though not understood at the time, was a risk for those who worked extensively with inks and pigments containing lead. Epidemics, like the Black Death and other waves of plague, periodically swept through Europe, devastating populations and forcing schools to close or relocate, disrupting education for years at a time. The overall lack of sophisticated medical understanding meant that serious illnesses could quickly become fatal. Discipline, as we discussed, was incredibly harsh by modern standards. The constant threat of corporal punishment, birching, caning, or other forms of physical correction, created an environment of fear. While seen as necessary for moral and intellectual development, this constant physical threat could also stifle creativity, independent thought, and mental well-being. The psychological toll of living under such strict, often brutal, discipline is hard to fully grasp from our modern perspective. The lack of privacy was another pervasive aspect of student life. Communal dormitories meant no personal space. Students ate together, slept together, studied in shared spaces, and were constantly under the watchful eye of their masters or circaders. This lack of solitude, combined with the rigid daily schedules, left little room for individual reflection or personal pursuits outside the prescribed curriculum. For many, this collective existence would have been an enduring part of their medieval schooling experience. Despite these immense challenges, the dedication of medieval students and masters is truly remarkable. They pursued knowledge, often at great personal cost, and under conditions that would deter most modern learners. Their perseverance speaks volumes about the value placed on education, however limited its access, and the profound human drive to understand the world and transmit knowledge across generations. These daily struggles weren't just background noise. They were integral to the medieval educational experience, shaping the character and resilience of the scholars who would go on to build the foundations of the modern world. Chapter 9. Beyond the classroom, social life, ritual, and ceremony. Medieval student life wasn't just about books and beatings. It also had its own rich social fabric, rituals, and ceremonies, especially at universities. These elements often provided a much-needed break from the academic grind and helped define the unique culture of medieval scholastic communities. Student nations were a defining feature of early universities, particularly in places like Bologna and Paris. Students grouped themselves by their region of origin, forming nations or guilds. These nations were powerful organizations. They had their own elected rectors, rules, and even their own courts to handle disputes among members. They provided a support network for students far from home, offering a sense of belonging and protection in a foreign city. They also played a key role in negotiating with townspeople over prices for lodging and food, and with university authorities over student privileges and curriculum. This structure reflects the fiercely local identities that were still strong in medieval Europe, even within a universalizing institution like the university. Rituals and ceremonies punctuated the academic year. Matriculation, formal enrollment, was an important first step, often involving an oath of obedience to the university's statutes. Graduation ceremonies were elaborate and solemn affairs, steeped in tradition. The granting of a degree, the licentia docendi for a master, or the bachelor's degree, was a public spectacle. It involved formal disputations where the candidate had to prove their intellectual prowess, followed by a ceremonial initiation into the body of masters or scholars. These events were often accompanied by feasting and celebration, paid for by the graduating student, often to their considerable financial burden. The academic dress we see today, with gowns and hoods, traces its origins directly back to the practical clothing worn by medieval scholars and clerics. Feasts and holidays provided crucial breaks from the rigorous schedule. The medieval calendar was full of religious holidays, and these were often observed with special masses, processions, and communal meals. While these breaks offered physical rest, they also reinforced the deeply religious context of medieval education. Beyond religious feasts, colleges might have their own special days for celebration, often tied to their patron saint or founder. These communal gatherings helped foster a sense of brotherhood and shared identity among students and masters. However, student life wasn't always harmonious. Town and gown conflicts were a recurring feature of medieval university towns. Students, often young, male, and far from home, could be rowdy and prone to drunkenness or brawling. Their special legal privileges, often granted by royal or papal authority, meant they were usually tried by university courts rather than local town courts, leading to resentment among townspeople. Disputes over prices, noise, women, and property could quickly escalate into violent clashes, sometimes involving hundreds of people and resulting in deaths. These conflicts often led to universities temporarily seceding, moving their operations to another town, demonstrating the power of the academic community. Student pranks and misbehavior were also common, despite the harsh discipline. Students, like young people in any era, found ways to push boundaries. Skipping classes, gambling, drinking, visiting brothels, and engaging in petty theft were all documented behaviors that masters tried to curb. Records often show masters complaining about students who were idle, wandering through the streets, or engaged in unlawful games. The very existence of strict rules and circaders suggests a constant battle between institutional authority and youthful exuberance. Religious life was not just a part of the schedule, but central to the student's entire existence. Daily attendance at masses and prayers was mandatory. For those in monastic or cathedral schools, religious life was their primary vocation. Even at universities, theology was the highest faculty, and all learning was ultimately understood as a path to understanding God and His creation. Students were expected to be devout, to pray for intellectual illumination, and to see their studies as a spiritual endeavor. This pervasive religious atmosphere meant that ethical and moral instruction was interwoven with academic learning. The library was the heart of any medieval educational institution. While access was often restricted due to the rarity and value of books, the library was where knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Monastic scriptoria, where monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, were the engines of book production. University libraries, often supplemented by private collections of masters, contained the essential texts for study. Students learned to respect books not just as tools, but as sacred objects, sometimes chained to desks to prevent theft or damage. The quiet, almost reverent atmosphere of a medieval library would have been a stark contrast to the lively, often noisy classrooms. Ultimately, the social life of a medieval student, while disciplined and often harsh, was also rich in shared experiences, communal rituals, and the unique camaraderie of fellow scholars. These interactions, both formal and informal, played a crucial role in shaping the identity of medieval intellectuals and in forging the bonds that characterize these enduring institutions. Chapter 10: The Curriculum's Practical Impact and Evolution. It's easy to look back at medieval education and see it as just focused on old languages and obscure religious debates. But for its time, the curriculum, particularly the 7 liberal arts, had a surprisingly practical impact and evolved to meet the changing needs of medieval society. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, wasn't just mental exercise. It provided fundamental skills essential for nearly any literate profession. Grammar, particularly Latin grammar, was the gateway to all higher learning and the international language of scholarship, government, and the church. Mastering it allowed communication across linguistic boundaries in Europe. Imagine a world where all important documents, legal proceedings, and scholarly debates happened in one shared language. Latin was that language. A fluent grammarian was indispensable as a clerk, scribe, diplomat, or church official. Rhetoric taught persuasive communication. In a society where public speaking was crucial for preaching, legal arguments, and political negotiation, rhetorical training equipped students to be effective advocates. Lawyers, preachers, diplomats, and even royal advisors relied on rhetorical skills to sway opinion and conduct business. The ability to compose clear, compelling letters and official documents was also a direct outcome of rhetorical training, vital for administration. Logic, the crown of the trivium, was perhaps the most practically useful. It taught students how to think critically, identify fallacies, and construct sound arguments. This wasn't just for philosophical debates. It was fundamental for dissecting legal cases, understanding complex theological doctrines, and managing the intricate financial accounts of merchants or manors. Medieval society was highly litigious and argumentative, and logical training provided the tools to navigate these intellectual battlegrounds. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, also had direct practical applications, often intertwined with their theoretical and theological significance. Arithmetic, while focused on number theory, provided the foundational understanding for basic calculation, essential for merchants, tax collectors, and estate managers. Even without modern numerals, understanding ratios and proportions was critical for commerce and administration. Geometry, rooted in Euclid, was crucial for architecture. Think of the cathedrals, land surveying, and military engineering. Builders needed to calculate angles and dimensions, and those managing large estates needed to measure land accurately for taxation and division. Music, though studied as mathematical ratios, connected directly to the pervasive liturgical life. Training in music theory allowed for better understanding and performance of the complex Gregorian chants and polyphony central to church services. Astronomy was profoundly practical. It was essential for calendar calculation, which determined the dates of religious festivals, sowing and harvesting seasons, and the timing of legal events. It was also crucial for navigation, though rudimentary compared to later periods. Perhaps, most importantly for daily life, it was intertwined with astrology, which medieval people used for everything from medical diagnoses and treatments to choosing auspicious times for journeys or important decisions. Over time, the curriculum evolved beyond the basic liberal arts. As towns grew and commerce expanded, there was a greater need for practical skills not covered in the traditional monastic or cathedral curricula. This led to the emergence of vernacular schools teaching in local languages by the 13th century, particularly in Italy and later elsewhere. These schools catered to the children of merchants and artisans, teaching basic literacy, numeracy, and business skills like accounting and foreign languages, directly responding to the demands of a burgeoning commercial economy. The rise of universities also marked a significant evolution. While they built upon the liberal arts, they introduced highly specialized professional training in law, medicine, and theology. Law faculties produced the judges, lawyers, notaries, and administrators who staffed the increasingly sophisticated legal systems of kingdoms and the church. This professionalization of law had a profound impact on the development of European legal thought and governance. Medicine faculties, though limited by scientific understanding, trained physicians who applied existing knowledge to public health, sanitation, and individual care. They were the forerunners of modern doctors, providing what medical care was available. Theology, while focused on religious doctrine, was also the discipline that grappled with the biggest ethical and philosophical questions, training the intellectual leaders of the church and influencing moral thought across society. This evolution from a primarily monastic focus on preserving religious knowledge to a more diversified system, training professionals for specific societal roles, shows the adaptability of medieval education. It was a dynamic process, shaped by intellectual traditions, economic pressures, social hierarchies, and the constant demand for skilled individuals to run an increasingly complex world. Far from being stagnant, medieval education was a vibrant, evolving force that laid the intellectual and institutional groundwork for much of what we recognize as modern learning. Chapter 11: Enduring Legacy and Final Reflections. And so, we arrive at our final contemplation of medieval schools and their lasting influence on the educational systems that continue to shape our world today. Medieval schools succeeded in maintaining educational continuity through political upheaval, while gradually adapting to meet evolving social needs, creating educational traditions that survived the collapse of the medieval world and influenced subsequent educational development in ways that continue to affect how we think about learning, teaching, and intellectual development. Their limitations, restricted access, linguistic barriers, and social stratification reflected medieval society's broader characteristics, while establishing tensions that would drive later educational reforms and democratization efforts. The exclusion of most of the population from formal education created social pressures that would eventually force the expansion of educational opportunities, while the emphasis on Latin created linguistic barriers that would eventually yield to vernacular education. The medieval period's greatest educational achievement was preserving and transmitting classical knowledge while developing new institutional forms and pedagogical methods that could serve an increasingly complex society. This educational foundation enabled the Renaissance, supported the development of modern nation-states, and established the university system that continues to shape global education today through its emphasis on systematic curriculum, formal credentials, and institutional autonomy. The daily rhythms of medieval education, governed by natural light and seasonal cycles, created relationships between learning and environment that modern education has largely abandoned in favor of artificial schedules and climate-controlled environments. The medieval integration of physical labor, intellectual work, and spiritual development provided comprehensive human formation that contemporary education often struggles to achieve through its specialized and compartmentalized approaches. The emphasis on memorization and oral instruction developed cognitive capabilities that modern students often lack, while the integration of religious observance with academic study provided meaning and purpose that secular education sometimes fails to supply. The medieval understanding of education as character formation rather than simply knowledge transmission offered comprehensive human development that addressed moral, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions of human growth. The physical hardships endured by medieval students, cold classrooms, uncomfortable seating, poor lighting, and inadequate nutrition created educational experiences that demanded extraordinary dedication and perseverance. These conditions, while undesirable from modern perspectives, fostered resilience and commitment that enabled students to master complex material under extremely challenging circumstances. The social hierarchies that characterized medieval education reflected broader social realities while providing pathways for advancement that, though limited, offered more opportunities than most previous societies had provided. The scholarship systems that enabled poor students to access advanced education established precedents for merit-based advancement that would eventually influence democratic educational ideals. The integration of practical and theoretical learning through the guild system created educational approaches that recognized different types of intelligence and provided appropriate training for diverse social roles. This recognition that not all students were suited for academic careers established educational flexibility that modern comprehensive education continues to struggle to achieve effectively. The medieval emphasis on community learning through shared dormitories, communal meals, and collective study created educational environments that fostered collaboration and mutual support alongside individual achievement. These social dimensions of learning provided human development that purely individualistic modern education often fails to replicate. The linguistic unity provided by Latin instruction created international scholarly communities that transcended political boundaries and enabled intellectual exchange across cultural divisions. This educational cosmopolitanism offered models for international cooperation that remain relevant in our globalized world, though the exclusive character of Latin education also created barriers that democratic education has worked to eliminate. The medieval integration of education with religious observance provided frameworks for addressing ultimate questions about human purpose and meaning that secular education often avoids or treats superficially. While the specific religious content of medieval education may not suit contemporary pluralistic societies, the recognition that education should address spiritual and moral dimensions of human development remains relevant for contemporary educators. The disciplinary methods employed in medieval schools, though harsh by modern standards, reflected systematic approaches to character formation that modern education often lacks. The emphasis on self-discipline, respect for authority, and submission to institutional requirements provided social training that enabled students to function effectively in hierarchical societies, though these same methods could stifle creativity and independent thinking. The economic barriers that limited access to medieval education created social pressures that eventually drove educational democratization, while the enormous costs of books and writing materials led to pedagogical methods that maximized learning through oral instruction and memorization. These resource constraints fostered educational efficiency and innovation that modern well-resourced systems sometimes lack. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval education created natural cycles of intensive learning and necessary rest that recognized human biological and psychological needs. The integration of education with agricultural and religious calendars provided meaningful connections between learning and life that modern education, with its artificial schedules and institutional isolation, often fails to achieve. The master-student relationships that characterized medieval education provided mentorship and personal formation that extended beyond simple knowledge transmission to include complete scholarly development. These intensive personal relationships created educational communities that fostered intellectual and moral development through direct modeling and individual attention that mass education systems struggle to replicate. The emphasis on disputation and formal debate in medieval education created intellectual skills that remain essential for democratic participation and professional effectiveness. The training in logical reasoning, argument construction, and public speaking provided practical capabilities that served students throughout their careers, while fostering intellectual rigor that modern education often fails to develop adequately. As we conclude our examination of medieval schools, we might reflect on both their achievements and limitations as educational institutions that served their society's needs, while establishing foundations for future development. These schools operated within severe constraints, limited resources, harsh physical conditions, restricted social access, and authoritarian pedagogical methods, yet succeeded in preserving human knowledge, developing institutional structures, and training the educated elites who would shape European civilization for centuries. Their greatest success was maintaining educational continuity through the collapse of Roman civilization, the upheavals of barbarian invasions, and the political fragmentation that characterized medieval life. Without these institutions, the knowledge of classical antiquity might have disappeared entirely, and the intellectual foundations for the Renaissance and modern civilization might never have been established. Their most significant limitation was the exclusion of most of the population from educational opportunities, creating a society where literacy and learning remained privileges of small elites rather than universal rights. This exclusion reflected and reinforced social hierarchies that limited human development and social progress, though it also enabled the concentration of resources necessary for preserving and advancing human knowledge during periods of scarcity and instability. The medieval educational experience, with all its hardships and limitations, demonstrates both human resilience in the pursuit of learning and the transformative power of educational institutions to shape individual lives and entire civilizations. These schools, operating in harsh conditions with limited resources, somehow managed to educate the scholars, administrators, and clergy who built the institutional foundations of modern European society. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed with central heating, electric lighting, and easy access to unlimited information, you might spare a thought for those medieval students who shivered in unheated dormitories, squinted over manuscripts by candlelight, and endured countless hours of birching, while somehow managing to preserve and transmit the intellectual heritage that makes our modern world possible. Their sacrifice and perseverance created the educational foundations upon which our comfortable, modern learning rests. And with that somewhat sobering thought about the price of human progress, we bid good night to the medieval schools and the countless students who suffered through their rigorous discipline to emerge as the educated leaders who shaped Western civilization. Sleep well, knowing that your educational complaints pale in comparison to those of students who somehow learned Latin grammar while sitting on hard wooden benches in freezing stone buildings, sustained by thin porridge and the occasional beating, yet emerged to create the intellectual foundations of the modern world. Sweet dreams of warmer, gentler times,